As the New York Football Giants prepare for the final 53-man roster cutdown coming at 4 p.m., we take a look at a series of big moves for Big Blue, including a trade with the Buffalo Bills. What does it mean for the current roster? Who's out? Who's going to the practice squad? And how do we feel about this quick turning direction that the New York Football Giants are going in? Of course, underneath the watchful eye of Joe Schoen. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets and the Locked On Nets podcast, and also your New Jersey Devils and the Devils Puck Luck podcast. Andy will be joining us momentarily as we dive into all the information and action here. And when I say momentarily, I mean like momentarily. We're going to get him into the conversation as we're talking about the 53-man roster. Obviously, a lot of cuts have already happened here. Giants are out on the field for practice, already getting notes about who's not on the field for practice, which can give us another layer about who else could be on the chopping block before the 4 p.m. hour. One brief second here before we tap in with Andy and dive in on the conversation. Yes, sir. Oh, boy. We've got some corrections to make here. We got a little bit wonky out here on the streets. We got to make sure that we get ourselves lined up like true pros. And then we can get into this conversation, Andy, obviously, as we're talking about the New York Football Giants, the cut down day coming here at 4 o'clock. But we figured, why not get the conversation going a little bit early? Because most of the big moves seem like they happened here early throughout the course of Tuesday.
Yeah, the flurry of activity is happening. Obviously, the Giants started making their cuts over the weekend after the Jets game, Adam. And so slowly we're hearing some of the names. I think it was some of the fringe guys that you would expect that maybe the Giants might be looking at the practice squad for. But also there's now some bigger names that Giant fans are going to be more familiar with that the Giants are cutting. Some of them they're going to hope to get back on the practice squad. Others are going to say, maybe there's an opportunity somewhere else for me to make a roster. So while the Giants would like to keep a lot of these players on their practice squad, a lot of them are going to have interest around the league, right, Adam?
Yeah, I think the funny thing is, too, and we talked about this over the last couple of years, and I think this is now another good reminder of that. Some of these names we're going to mention here, yes, they've had roles for the Giants. In a lot of situations, it's depth roles, but we could have better depth, right? We can improve our roster, and I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that, specifically around a couple of defensive players that we'll touch in on here. We know the Giants already made the trade, obviously, earlier last week, with Isaiah Simmons coming over from the Arizona Cardinals in exchange for a 7th-round pick. They also picked up Bashum in a trade for a late-round pick swap with the Buffalo Bills. So all these things start to impact how this roster is going to lay out. And from that standpoint, we came in yesterday, talked about some of the early cuts that were going on. These ones are far more juicy today. But I think the easiest way to go through this, Andy, is just go position by position, because every single spot on this roster saw somebody new today, maybe outside of tight end, saw somebody new today have a decision get made about them. And I think almost every single one of them is going to be interesting. So if we just start right in at the quarterback spot, we know, obviously, Tommy DeVito. I came really close to just saying Danny DeVito right there. He gets cut. The idea is that he makes it through the practice squad. If you're the New York Giants, you like what you saw from him. Hopefully nobody else thinks that there's something there worth grabbing onto here on the waiver wire.
Yeah, I mean, listen, he was undrafted. The Giants picked him up. It looks like, the coaching staff did a really great job. Mike Kafka's system is touted as one of those that's quarterback friendly. Look at the way that Daniel Jones took to the ownership and learning that Kafka gave him. And so when you have Kafka and Dable, you see people like Tommy DeVito undrafted in just a couple of months. Now Giant fans are hoping that he doesn't get activated to another roster, but this was kind of expected. Tyrod Taylor is still under contract. You want a veteran leader behind Daniel Jones, just in case that can get by for a couple of games, maybe go 500, for the Giants. Tommy DeVito feels a little bit more like a project for the Giants. You hope that he can get back on the practice squad, continue to learn, and maybe there's an opportunity for him to stay on this practice squad this year and fight for that number 2 quarterback position next season.
Yeah, of course. And welcome into everybody if you're watching us live over on YouTube. Second back-to-back days doing live. Got a great comment in there that we are going to get to here when we tap back into that trade for Basham. And I think a favorable nickname. Sometimes there's really good stats out there on that type of stuff. As we move our attention, I agree with you, obviously, on DeVito. We'll see how it shakes out. Sometimes the only thing you worry about is bad teams that don't have a lot of options and maybe just think, hey, what's the worst case scenario? You take a flyer on a guy like this. Unlikely, at least in my mind. Let's go into the running back room there. This is where maybe the first kind of surprising one. We talked about this before. I think you and I, less surprised, maybe more disappointed. I would have preferred, I think you would have preferred that Matt Breida be the guy that was on the chopping block and a guy like Jashuan Corbin continue to stay with this team because he showed a little something here in the preseason and in training camp. Whether or not he makes it to the practice squad, because he's a running back, I think it hits a little bit different, right? Because there's so many of these players out there. You like your in-house guy. It's not like he's ever been, getting significant reps at the NFL level since he came into the league. So maybe he gets through there. But this as much to me is about what they saw in Eric Gray, and how he performed throughout the summer here that tells you we're willing to take the risk on losing a guy like Corbin.
Yeah, Eric Gray obviously has special teams duty, was returning kicks, so he has that additional value. And what you're
Yep.
seeing, Adam, is all of these different guys that maybe are the third or fourth string. It's, can you do multiple things for us, right? Can
Yeah.
you return kicks? Can you be a gunner on special teams? Like, what was one of the main reasons why we thought Bryce Ford Wheaton had an opportunity to make this roster before he ultimately got injured and got put on IR for the season. But yeah, it's tough with Jashuan Corbin. Jordan Renan just tweeted out just about 20, 30 minutes ago that there's injured Giants that are not practicing who all made the initial 53-man roster. According
Yes.
to Brian Dable, one of those ends up being Gary Brightwell. And that really was, I think, the decision that the Giants had to make. Was they like Breida, they have familiarity with him, played in Dable's system in Buffalo, knows the offense, feels like he can pick it up and run with it. So really, it felt like they were getting squeezed out between that one last running back position between a guy like Gary Brightwell and Jashuan Corbin. And the Giants decided to keep Brightwell for a whole host of reasons, but also that versatility we mentioned before.
Yeah, exactly. Special teams value there too. And it's funny, a theme of this is there's some guys that are holdovers from the previous regime that seem like they've got pushed out here. And then there's few guys that have fought through. And we're not talking about the high level guys like Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. Talent wins out. But from a depth perspective, we said, and maybe this is us. And by the way, Corbin was a draft pick for this regime, right? So the fact that they've gone with Brightwell, I mean, Brightwell's a survivor. In spite of having some injuries this summer, he continues to come back. And you can go back to last year and look at those runs that he had. And it doesn't take a lot to squint and say, yes, he has been a running back that has developed nicely for the Giants, and then obviously has the versatility as well. Kicking it in. And by the way, there's a good note here on team captains were named as well. So we'll take a timeout in between offense and defensive side of the ball to hit some of those notes there as the Giants got onto the field at 1:45 this afternoon. Then it was noted by Dan Duggan, by the way, that this is probably where you have a pretty strong sense of where the roster stands, because you don't put out guys that you're planning on cutting, releasing, etc., to potentially have an injury or otherwise if you're going to be moving on from them. Into the wide receiver room then, where there's a couple of interesting things here, right? So you mentioned Bryce Ford Wheaton, of course, and this is why special teams matters now, because that's where we thought he could be angling in. He's not going to be a part of it. Khalil Pimpleton. Khalil. I thought he could stay in there. The Giants went so tiny across the wide receiver room. I thought he had a real shot. Jamison Crowder also not going to be a part of this room as well. David Sills, the standout in the final preseason game, as he always is, also on the chopping block here. Anything surprise you when we talk about to me, I guess Cole Beasley, I'm like, you son of a gun, you're doing it. And it ties directly to the fact that Wan'Dale Robinson is not being put on the PUP list to start the season. And as Art Stapleton acutely pointed out, the Giants then seem to have some sense that he'll be ready to go before the week 4 matchup with Seattle. And you don't want to have to keep him on the shelf for those extra games.
Yeah, Wan'Dale Robinson being healthy and ready to go. Obviously, it would have been an easier decision in the wide receiver room if he wasn't ready and the Giants said, let's not rush you back. But he
Right.
almost is forcing the Giants' hand by saying, I am healthy. I am ready to go. Look spry in some of the limited work that he was doing off to the side. The Giants are going to activate him, which changes things. I think that sealed Jamison Crowder's fate. It kind of
Yeah.
sealed a little bit of David Sills' fate, just knowing that there wasn't going to be enough room at the end, so to speak, for those players. What I do find fascinating is, even though Cole Beasley, we've talked about it before, go with the younger guys. Jordan Renan just about 10 minutes ago said they're going to be cutting Cole Beasley, but because he's a vested veteran, he doesn't go through
Yes.
waivers. No other team is going to claim him. So the idea is he can re-sign with the Giants after they do all this different shuffling. It's one of the advantages of having familiarity with a player where you can kind of go to him and say, hey, listen, if you want to be here, we want you here. But like procedurally, we need a little bit more flexibility. So if you just stick around for a quick minute, then, we'll find a way to massage things to kind of keep you in the building.
Yeah, really nice job yesterday from Patricia Traina, who outlined some of these different layers to that. And we talked a little bit yesterday about vested vets and how, hey, if you only have a 53-man roster, but this guy is not at risk of getting lost in the shuffle here, you then keep someone important that maybe you want to get to the practice squad eventually, but you don't want them to have to go through waivers in order to get there. So Beasley falls into it. I do just make the note here for Pistol 27 Pete. No, listen, I didn't think that Khalil Pimpleton had a real chance to make the roster, but I just, again, when you see all these guys, and I'll go back to the well on it in this sense. I would have preferred never signing Jamison Crowder this offseason and just letting Khalil Pimpleton get extra reps in preseason games just for the sake of seeing him, right? You went and grabbed him off of Detroit last year. Why not? You need not go beyond that, but return value as well, special teams value potentially for him. So it'd be interesting to see if any of these young guys specifically end up catching on with other teams when we talk about the waiver wire. So the wide receiver room saw a lot going on. You know what they didn't see going on? Sterling Shepard. Sterling Shepard ain't going anywhere, friends. That guy's going to be out there. And I think it's really worth remembering, too, that Sterling Shepard is so much more than a slot receiver. Saw him even returning some kicks there in the final preseason game as well. I think he's trying to maximize what he can be for this roster. And at least in this moment, he's still a part of it. I almost don't want to be too bullish because it's you can't put your eggs in any basket here as Joe Schoen and the Giants continue to work through. All right.
Yeah, well, Adam, the one thing I was going to say on Sterling Shepard, Brian Daboll mentioned Sterling Shepard's health. Obviously, the health of Sterling Shepard and Wan'Dale Robinson was why some of these reinforcements did not make the roster. You mentioned Jamison Crowder. We mentioned Colin Johnson before, who got released over the weekend. Thought he might have an opportunity because he really showed up in camp last year before having a season-ending injury. But yeah, it looks like Sterling Shepard is going to be on this roster. Brian Daboll was just talking about him and the decisions behind Wan'Dale Robinson and others. Good to see him back. I think you and I both thought he's kind of the heart and soul of this team. He is a guy that everyone loves in the locker room. And if he was going to be healthy, we both felt like he was going to make this roster, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's easy to forget because of his injuries. If Sterling Shepard, even at 30 years old, is 100% healthy, he is a better player in wide receiver than Darius Slayton, right? He's a better player in wide receiver than Isaiah Hodgins, as high as we are on him. You can look at him and Paris Campbell and go, let's go toe-to-toe about who's the better wide, right? Like he is maybe the best wide receiver in terms of experience and what they've accomplished when healthy. But health matters here, and that's why you go get a Paris Campbell. It's why you draft the Jalen Hyatt. Guess what? Jalen Hyatt, he's going to make the cut. They're going to keep him.
Oh, yeah.
Smart choice. Yes, I think it's bold move, but a smart strategy. So 100%. We'll see how that shakes out there. Turning our attention to let's just hit tight ends real quick here, just because nothing happened. Darren Waller, Daniel Bellinger, Lawrence Cager. Cager had a nice catch down on the sideline in the final preseason game as well. There's been injuries that have gone on around there, and I think, am I mistaken that there was a tight end signing though as well? I don't know if you see that in the background there. For some reason, I thought maybe I caught that they had done something here in the wind. If not, injuries with Myrick, injuries with Sweeney, just things that happened here. But even at the onset, you and I we agreed, like this is the top three. Lawrence Cager, more so now this season than last season, fits the mold of athletic tight end redundancy behind Darren Waller.
Yeah, Chris Myrick was one where obviously the Giants like him for his versatility. He's kind of like that old school mold where he could be a fullback in bigger jumbo type packages. He's not necessarily the pass catching threat that a guy like Darren Waller or Lawrence Cager is. Sure. Felt like he had an opportunity to stick around. Obviously, season-ending hand injury is really tough for the Giants to absorb that. But they really weren't going to probably have more than three guys on the roster anyway. So, in all of it, it feels like it was a blessing to be able to keep him in the building, rehabbing and training, and not necessarily lose someone else that we really liked, like a Lawrence Cager.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it kind of, injuries are never a good thing. You never want to see it. And sometimes it just helps make decisions a little bit easier, especially when you have a lot of guys that you're trying to cover. Okay, here's the juicy part of the offensive side of the ball. the offensive line. So we all knew that Neil Glowinski, JMS, Bredesen, Thomas, those guys aren't going anywhere. We knew that Azudu, we can figure out who's going to be starting, but we knew he was going to be a part of it. Here's where I'm disappointed in myself, Andy, because yesterday when I covered this, and even when you and I talked about it, I had said, yeah, Matt Pert looks like he's making it through. As surprised as we all are, Matt Pert is going to make it through being looked at the swing tackle spot. Tyree Phillips, who was a part of this team last year as well, all the indications were that he just was not performing well this summer. And I said, I think he's a cut candidate. And I slowly backed off of it because there was no other way to go. Who's going to be the better option? He got cut. And I just think this just comes down to, even if we don't think we have the strongest options available to us, we're not going to hold a roster spot for somebody that did not perform this summer and earn their spot.
Yeah, Wyatt Davis was released earlier over the weekend or the last couple of days. He kind of filled in at offensive tackle during some of the preseason games, and he did not look good. He didn't have the versatility to be able to maybe cover the guard spot and the tackle spot. So when that kind of sealed Wyatt Davis's fate, I am surprised that Tyree Phillips didn't make the roster, because I'm part of the reason why you backed off of that prognostication, Adam, because I said, surely you got to have two backup swing tackles, right? Like you have to do it, especially after Matt Pert looked as shaky as he did. What I think this is a real indication of is they're like, we're still looking for offensive line help. We're not done, but Tyree Phillips was not the guy that necessarily we had envisioned he was going to be. So Pert, as people are mentioning in the comments, is a very big liability, but he's been in the building for a few years. They at least know who he is. I wouldn't be surprised if the Giants go out and have multiple offensive linemen that are different from them who's making the roster right now before week 1 against the Cowboys, Adam. Like, if Phillips isn't making it and Pert looked as shaky as he did, don't be surprised if there are multiple claims that the Giants put in for offensive line help.
Yeah, because don't forget, Jack Anderson was let go. Wyatt Davis was let go. You had, I think, one additional came out here more recently. I'll forget who it was, but they basically cleared out the entirety of the depth inside of the offensive line room right now. And just to your point, I think it comes down to guy that's still hanging on, right? Oshane Ximines, is he still hanging on? Did he get let go? I mean, talk about shock of all shocks, right? So coming from the previous regime, guys that had different opportunities. Oshane Ximines, arguably as a 5th-round pick, really flashed early, and you and I got excited about him, and then kind of fell off the table, and you just think, yeah, new regime, he'll slowly tumble down. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, Ben Bredesen, he's working across guard and center. Maybe he's going to be a starting guard potentially. Well, if he is Azudu ready to be a backup center? I don't know about that. And Oshane Ximines maybe is just like trying to claw out a role for himself here. And this is where I like what the Giants are doing. They're keeping at least some of the younger, even though Pert, we said, is 25 going on 26. They're keeping some of the younger guys, at least for right now, because those guys at least have some upside, though I won't be shocked as I finish the sentence, Oshane Ximines gets cut.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, and this comes up from Blessed Believer in the chat, is the Giants aren't getting anyone good when you're picking at 25 on the waiver claim. Like every single
waiver claim.
26. Well, so that is 100% true. It's the reason why the Giants are going out and making moves that they are, with Isaiah Simmons, with Boogie Bashum, who we'll talk about it when we flip over to the defensive side of the ball. The Giants are trying to make these fringe moves by swapping picks or late round picks to be able to do this, because they know there are offensive line needy teams that are ahead of them. And if there's a player that provides depth, it's probably going to get scooped up before the Giants are even able to make some of these claims.
And I 98% agree with Blessed Believer, and I agree with the sentiment. But remember too, think about all the cuts that are happening here. There's only 32 NFL teams. There's 25 teams ahead of the Giants for that first waiver claim. There's going to be a lot of talent. Not every player that is talented or has value is going to be valuable to every team. Now, does that mean that the Giants are going to get the cream of the crop for offensive line backups? No. Most teams aren't giving up good backup offensive tackles unless they have a real depth there. And I named yesterday a couple of teams like the Detroit Lions who let go of a couple of guys, veterans and young players, that maybe the Giants, if they get there, can take a look at. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what the Giants can get there, even if it's marginal. Now, that being said, the correct perspective is here. You're not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 on the waiver claim. So every time it cycles, you know that you're falling further down the list there.
Yeah, and the other names that you mentioned from the tackle position, a couple other transactions. Corey Cunningham was released on Sunday. Julian Davenport was released on Sunday. You mentioned all these tackle depth pieces that we had in here. But it's starting to really thin out the room. And listen, I know. We watched it in preseason. It was not good. The second and third string guys weren't able to handle business or just be like replacement level for the Giants. And so we have identified that there is an even bigger need. I wouldn't be surprised if there's other transactions or other moves for a guy that might get released from another team where Joe
Yeah.
Schoen does something similar that he's done with both Ximines and Basham.
I agree. Yeah, 100%. So watching the offensive line here and the waiver wire is going to be fascinating. Let's take a brief pause here from having the conversation around the cuts. We'll go to the defensive side of the ball where there is a lot of interesting notes here. And again, another PUP situation on that side for a player that we haven't really talked a lot about this offseason because he hasn't been available and healthy and able to play. But also named today, 22 players were nominated in-house to be captains for the New York Football Giants. They whittled it down to 10. Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, notable free agent acquisition, Darren Waller, trade acquisition, I should say, Andrew Thomas, Dexter Lawrence, Leonard Williams, free agent acquisition, Bobby Okereke, Adoree Jackson, Xavier McKinney, and Graham Gano. This is the blend, right? This is the blend of the guys you've had in-house, the guys you knew were going to be a part of it, but the two key additions this offseason, one offensively, one defensively. I'm not shocked by either one of these things. Okereke is going to be the green dot wearer, so you knew he was going to be a vocal leader and a veteran, so players are going to look to him and respect him. And Darren Waller is clearly, he is clearly the alpha in that room right now because whether it's guys that have been injured or young players that are still developing, Waller is also the guy with the experience in that room that you're going to lean on.
Yeah, and Xavier McKinney has had some interesting tweets in this offseason. Seemed like I don't know if it was directed at the Giants or other places. People have drawn their own conclusions. This is still the Giants saying, you are our best safety. You are clearly the guy that we are going to rely on. We need you. And so that's why you make him a captain. I'm excited to see that. I think it would have been a bigger story if he was not named a captain. Then all of a sudden there'd be some different rumors swirling, like how long is Xavier McKinney going to be on the Giants?
100%. So, and just one little note here. We didn't mention McCathan, who is going to be on the starting roster as of right now, the 53-man roster. We wondered if he was going to be a candidate for the practice squad potentially just because of the injury and coming off of it. This also indicates, some level of, again, previous regime, new regime, and let's just see where this goes. Maybe they think that he's closer to being a solid backup than further away, and you're just hedging your bets until that opportunity comes. Though, again, I believe we're going to be talking about some incoming offensive line depth here for the Giants. Defensively, my friends, a lot of things happen. Let's start at the nose tackle. Nothing really of note here. Lawrence, Nunez, Roche, and Riley, they're going to be there, obviously. Ryder Anderson, maybe he's the first one, indicated that he will ultimately be cut here behind Leonard Williams and Oshane Robinson. We had said when we did a little look at the 53 going back to last week, a lot of bodies in the defensive front room there. Again, sometimes I feel like I'm like, oh, that's surprising. And then you do a double take and go, is it? Because they brought in two other veteran players and they were clearly ahead of them on the depth chart. And this just feels like, again, a numbers game where why are we going to hold this spot right now at the 53 for a player that what is the rep count even going to look like for him coming into this season?
Yeah, listen, they did make the Oshane Robinson and Nunez Roche, like they did go out and get some defensive line help in the offseason, and they gave a bunch of money to, Dexter Lawrence. They have Leonard Williams at the third or fourth largest cap hit in the league this year. So there's a lot invested in the defensive line right now. We saw shades of what could be with Jordan Riley over the preseason. And so there's just not that many spots on the defensive line to really rotate things out or keep a couple extra guys on the roster. So I'm not really fully surprised with how this has gone. And the fact that, you may have found something in Jordan Riley, you got to keep him around and see what might happen, right?
And the fact that he's young, I think, is what makes it easier to then let go of another guy, right? Hey, this is a player, late round pick. We think there's something there, and we want to make sure that we keep him around. Now we get interesting, and all the other guys that you're thinking about. I talked about this yesterday. The Jeters of the world on that defensive front, they were let go. These are so far back end guys that they're not terribly surprising in any way, shape, or form. The guys that are anywhere close to the second on the depth chart, they become intriguing, and that's why when we start talking about the linebacker room and the edge rushing room, really, Azeez Ojulari, Kayvon Thibodeaux, obviously nothing to worry about there. The veteran Ward's going to be there. We mentioned Okereke, obviously team captain, brought in. He's going to be there. Now, when Isaiah Simmons was brought in, a lot of the conversations have been about what's his role going to be. It seems like it's crystallizing as we're going to play him at inside linebacker. We're not going to put him out on the edge. Now, let's be clear. We know it's Wink Martindale's system, so there's going to be a lot of movement there. But if you put him in this room, then all of a sudden it's going to be Okereke and Simmons, you would think. And while this can shuffle, then it's Darian Beavers and McFadden behind him. Carter Coughlin still hanging on. Love that he is. But Deontay Johnson gone. And then these are the big ones. First, Oshane Ximines, which we started to round into that reality the last couple of days. Then Timon Fox as well, though. Like, they wiped out the edge rushing depth on the one side of this line here. And to me, just like the offensive line, there's going to be a move here. We know they went out and got a player here, obviously, in Boogie, excuse me. But they still need more. Like, so this just looks like the guy, you know, last year's roster is not this year's roster. Last year's reps are not this year's reps. And they knew it wasn't going to be good enough with Oshane Ximines.
Yeah, a little bit of a surprise. Dan Duggan from The Athletic just said that there's a couple players that aren't spotted at practice. You presume that the majority of them are being cut. But, you know, we talked about Cole Beasley before being one of those guys that's a vested veteran that might, you know, hold off for a little bit, then get re-signed. Lawrence Cager is not seen at practice. Darian Beavers not seen at practice as well, Adam, which was surprising to me. Again, we're kind of trying to read into the tea leaves. But, you know, a guy that we thought could be starting, in one of the middle linebacker positions, inside linebacker, not there. It would be a surprise if he is not around, considering he was drafted by this team and they were going to start him last year if he was healthy. But the Giants are making some different moves at the linebacking position, especially with the trade for Boogie from the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, Bashum. Yeah, exactly. And now you're talking about different players. Although when asked about it, Brian Daboll said, yeah, they're running a different system in Buffalo. Got to get him in here. Got to work with him. And maybe this is my one, I'll call it a concern. I find this intriguing. You know, we keep talking about how you want to improve the depth, but the Giants waited, right? They waited all the way until cutdown day to make this move. Oshane Ximines and Timon Fox have been in camp. They've been playing. They've been getting the reps. Now, Oshane Ximines looks like he played himself out of an opportunity, right? Fan favorite kind of Timon Fox, I think, has been well liked, but it's interesting. It's interesting to think about that. Listen, opportunities need to be there to make moves, but the Giants are making a lot of changes to key depth roles here a week away from the start of the season, right? Like, we are counting down to taking on the Dallas Cowboys. And whether or not I was bullish on Oshane Ximines or Timon Fox or what Darian Beavers is going to be or Micah McFadden, like all these guys that are going to be or not be a part of the roster, it makes it harder to think that what's going to happen in the short term for the Giants is we're going to run deep. Like, you're going to run heavy reps if you're at the top of a lot of these depth positions. And maybe what happened on that defensive line, the players they brought in, has impacted how heavily they think they need to be concerned with some of the edge and linebacker depth here, feeling like we can control it up front and then be effective when we get our opportunities.
Yeah, the big name that everyone's going to talk about is Oshane Ximines. Obviously, third-round pick for the Giants, has been in the building for a while. The Giants re-signed him, as a depth piece. But really, it just didn't seem like he was getting the pressure that the Giants needed. It didn't feel like he was going to be the guy behind Ojulari and Kayvon Thibodeau that could get pressure. And so Joe Schoen went out and he said, what about Boogie Bashum? I think that's a really interesting move. Swap out an old third-round pick for a second-round pick that's a little bit younger that might still have an opportunity to make a name for himself in this league. The Giants swapped picks, late round picks in next year's draft to be able to have him. Another one of those, instead of waiting for the waiver claim on a young, talented, edge rushing type guy, Joe Schoen just went out and said, hey, if I have to flip this 10, 15 spots in the draft to be able to get this guy in the building, I will. Clearly, the second that he was signed, it kind of had the writing on the wall for at least Ximines. I was surprised to see Fox on that list as well, thinking that maybe he did enough. But Adam, that just shows that Joe Schoen isn't happy with a lot of these depth pieces that are names that the Giants know, and he thinks he can do better either on the open market or with other guys that may get released over the coming days.
I won't be surprised if next offseason, the same way he talked this offseason about the defensive line, we wanted to improve, we couldn't, we knew the depth wasn't good enough. Then they go out this offseason, they really address it head on, right, in free agency. I think next offseason we could be having the same conversation where Joe Schoen is saying, yeah, we didn't love our depth coming into camp. We were, we had a little more flexibility, but not as much as we may have liked. And we just kind of had to go with what we could, but we tried to improve as best we could through a couple of trades, waivers, etc. But this is what we have to do to try to improve this team, and then we'll worry about depth going forward. It is worth noting on Darian Beavers, because I have to acknowledge it, being someone who's a big fan of his coming out of Cincinnati. These two things are true. Beavers has looked very slow this preseason. I think he has. Like, he does not show the range and speed that we were led to believe he could have, and that comes down to coming back from the injury. And I'll even say, I find it interesting that him making the practice squad would also be a very easy thing to have happen here if the Giants got into a numbers crunch, because is someone jumping out for a player that we thought, hey, he got taken, way later than he should have. Could have been a 4th-round pick. All right, maybe could have. Coming off an injury, didn't look fantastic in camp and in the preseason. He might be a very easy slip through the practice squad, and then you could always reshuffle if there's a specific player that you don't want to risk losing on the waiver wire. So it's a good note here when we talk about some of these key moves.
Well, keep in mind, Adam, Darian Beavers was drafted in the 6th round. He had slipped. Other teams had passed on him multiple times. And what has happened since then? He's gotten injured with an injury that has made him look slower. So it would be a lot for another team to activate him, claim him, and put him on the 53, knowing that he was passed off 12 months ago. And the only thing that's happened, he hasn't even played in a regular season game. He's had a debilitating injury that kept him out for the year. So a team would really have to say, man, we really liked what we saw in 2 preseason games 12 months ago on a guy that was a late round pick to begin with. So for me, I think maybe I shouldn't be as surprised as I am not seeing Beavers out there, knowing that the Giants may say, who else is a candidate to put their hand up and say, I'm willing to put a claim in on him?
100%. So that there is this idea of, even if you like the player in-house, what is the logical way to get from here through the 53 to the practice squad and then build it out. So it would be surprising, but when you talk it out loud, you go, okay. Same thing, by the way, with a guy like David Sills, right? Like, fan favorite and all this stuff. He's been with the Giants for years. Nobody ever comes for him. So we like him and he flashes, but it's not like, and he's only getting older. It's not like, hey, well, now, be careful. He had, 6-7 catches, 81 yards, touchdown in the final preseason game. Yes, he does that every preseason. And every preseason he gets cut. And and then after the 53-man, he goes to the practice squad. So interesting to see how some of these guys shake out, obviously. Let's go. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, David Sills reminds me so much of Alex Bachman. If any Giant fans that have been around here for a couple of years, where he has these preseason flashes, and we like him because he's a homegrown guy. We think he could stick around. Guess what? A few hours ago, injury waive designation from the Houston Texans. Alex Bachman is back out on the market, and that's the type of thing that may happen to David Sills, where it's like maybe you'll get an opportunity somewhere else, but hey, listen, if you stay with the Giants on the practice squad and there's an injury or two, the system, you can instantly be able to be placed into it and maybe try to contribute. So for me, like, a guy like David Sills should look elsewhere if he can make the 53-man roster. But ultimately, it seems like he's going to be another guy that might end up on the practice squad.
Context on just flipping back over here, since we're seeing some stuff come in from Dan Duggan on Cager. Dan Duggan saying, I had forgotten that he was limping pretty good post-game on Saturday. I think he'll make it. Also, I'd advise against freaking out about any moves until the dust settles in a few days. So just a good note on Lawrence Cager in terms of the surprising some names getting listed there, right? Bubble players who were practicing, offensive lineman Shane Lemieux and defensive lineman DJ Davidson, who would still be guys that you could consider to be on there. Cam Brown, by the way, has not been cut by the New York Football Giants for all the talk we were having about who's making it or not. Right now, Oshane Ximines, Timon Fox out, Cam Brown holding on here, and I do wonder he may and ultimately get cut depending on what's needed. But again, when you lose Bryce Ford-Wheaton, you go right back into your special teams room. Cam Brown was the captain for special teams. Like, you are trying to thread this needle about making sure you cover your bases here. So another one to watch there. Now we get to go ahead before we get to secondary.
I was just going to say on the Cam Brown front, Jordan Renan less than an hour ago said there's a couple of injured Giants that are not practicing who all made the initial 53. Cam Brown was one of those people. So just keep in mind, they still like him. He's coming. He has a little bit of an injury, but he's expected to be part of this 53-man roster to start. And I think that's the key thing that we need to take with a grain of salt, as Dan Duggan pointed out. This is to start. There is a whole host of other teams that are doing exactly what the Giants are doing. And some of these pieces still at the back end may be interchangeable, in terms of being on this roster.
And it's funny too, man, because like Cam Brown and then Darian Beavers, right? Let's just tie these two guys together. They're in the linebacking room there. Now, Cam Brown seems to be a special teams guy. Like, that's going to be his role. But when you watch him out in preseason the last couple of years, you go, hey, he moves around pretty good. He doesn't always get to the spots, or he makes his mistakes. But to compare visually in my mind those two players, I'm like, yeah, either one, right? Like either one wants to be good or serviceable. I'm totally happy with that. So you really just want to have the best players come to the top here. Okay. I knew we were going to spend a bit of time there because there was just a lot happening inside of that linebacker room. But then the secondary. And I said it about Wan'Dale Robinson on the offensive side of the ball. We know that it was going to be Deonte Banks, Adoree Jackson. Obviously, you're going to get Trey Hawkins, the standout from this summer. We're going to be up there on the starting rotation. Incidentally, too, we mentioned and covered this yesterday, and I think previously, but Darnay Holmes, he took the pay cut. It was indicated by, I think, Dan Duggan, could have been by Jordan Renan, that the number on the veteran minimum would be just north of $1 million, which they would assume the number would go to. So you'd be talking about clearing off 1.5, 1.6 million in cap savings, which can free Joe Schoen up to go do something after the waiver wires settle, and you just want to outright go sign somebody. Because, by the way, good to remember here, some guys you claim on the waivers, you got to pick up the contract. You got to pay some money out, right? So some cuts are about back-end roster dudes, undrafted guys. Other ones are financially tied. Would have been the case like a player like Isaiah Simmons, if they had picked up the fifth-year option, right, and gotten to all this big money. You could have been talking about, yeah, we're going to release him. Okay, you want to pick up even this year the 6 and change? Now the Giants only have to take on 3.5 for his contract. I go long, but the big surprise is I thought Aaron Robinson was the big surprise for me in the secondary. Going to start potentially on the PUP list. Forgotten man for you inside of this secondary room that maybe if he can get healthy, once upon a time, he was going to be starting on the outside for the New York Football Giants.
Yeah, not surprised. Still coming off an injury. I think the Giants want to ease him back into it while they still figure out this room. It's like he is the additional reinforcements that can come in a few games in. We know there's going to be injuries, especially to positions like the cornerback in the secondary, wide receiver. There's going to be injuries, and having guys that are going to be fully healthy, ready to go, perfectly fine by me. What I thought was interesting, Jordan Renan had mentioned injured Giants that aren't practicing who made the initial 53.
Yeah.
We talk about Cordell Flott. We talk about Nick McLeod. We talk about Javarius Owens, as well as Bobby McLean in that secondary in terms of people that are making the roster that are not out there right now.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. A guy like Javarius Owens, I thought he did enough. The one thing that I kept thinking about too, which now I don't know the timing of it, right? Making it like the Giants going and making a trade for a player instead of having to go through the waivers. We thought maybe Bobby McCain, 30 years old. Is there a value out there for somebody else to want to come get him? Owens, I think my concern with him is that he flashed so much that there's a risk here that if you do end up cutting him, that he's going to be a guy that someone would come take a flyer on. He's young. He showed good things in the preseason. The Giants know what the top of their safety room kind of looks like there. Nobody else other than that, though, I'm not particularly concerned with. The McCains, the McLeods of the world, I can take or leave it. We know what the back end looks like now with McKinney, with Pinnock, with Belton, right? So I really actually, I'm more surprised that you didn't cut one of those players instead of a Timon Fox or maybe instead of an Oshane Ximines in the short term before figuring out what makes the most sense. It may be moot if they all end up getting cut, but right now it's what's the easier or smarter path to get through?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned before, when Darnay Holmes decided to take the pay cut, it kind of sealed the fate of some of these other cornerbacks that thought they could make it if they were the cheaper option at 80% or 90% of the value that someone like Darnay Holmes would bring. He clearly had made it through after negotiating. We mentioned it on Twitter. We hope that he has the same impact that Darius Slayton did, where it felt like he was going to be the forgotten man last year and then came back and got re-signed by the new regime. So you hope that this is a motivating factor for Darnay Holmes. I think that the Giants really like the trio in the secondary of Jason Pinnock, Dane Belton, and Xavier McKinney. Now you're thinking about, do we have one or a couple of different guys to be able to back them up and support them? Javarius Owens did enough, and Bobby McLean feels like the other one. It seems like the Giants feel comfortable with the safety position, which is one of the reasons why they let Julian Love go in the offseason as well.
So I'm just trying to think if there's any other notes here. I'm just scanning through real quick here. I think for the most part, really the last thing I wanted to kind of take a look at here is where do the numbers stand right now on where the Giants are in getting that 53-man roster. We know that the cut time is going to come at 4:00, so there's still a bit more to do here. And I do want to flip back around just thinking about where we currently stand inside of these rooms and some of the moves that could get made here. There were a lot of notable cuts around other teams. I mentioned earlier about the Detroit Lions and having some good offensive linemen. And right now, probably as we're doing this, think about, there's been a dozen, 15 cuts that have come from the New York Football Giants. That's happening around the league right now. So there are literally hundreds of players just flooding the market right now. And you start to just really try to pull in and figure out, well, who makes sense, who could plug in, who's going to be too high on the waiver wire for us to get so the Giants can fill in some of these needs and holes.
Yeah, the one thing, if we're flipping it back over to the offensive side of the ball, Pat
Yeah.
Leonard just tweeted out a couple minutes ago, there are 9 Giant offensive linemen on the practice field today. Andrew Thomas, Evan Neal, Matt Pert. Literally the only 3 offensive tackles that are out there for the Giants today. They don't even have enough to be able to swap in shifts of people. So clearly be on the lookout for that to change. At guard, we mentioned Ben Bredesen, Mark Lewinsky, Izudu. Shane Lemieux made it, and Marcus McKeithen all are practicing today. You assume that all of them are going to make the roster. And then John Michael Schmitz is the only center, obviously, with Ben Bredesen backing him up. This feels like the 9 they're going with now, but I would not be surprised. In fact, I would, if I was a wagering man, I would expect the Giants to make a decision at the tackle position before they go into week 1 against the Dallas Cowboys. You just can't have 3 offensive tackles and one of them be Matt Pert. It just isn't possible, Adam.
Well, you say that now, you know what I mean? But then maybe
I'll eat my words, but I know that the listeners right now are saying, if Matt Pert is the only person that we have behind Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal, we are just asking for a disaster to happen.
And it's funny too, because on that front, and we'll take a look at some of the comments here before we close out. And I'm going to try to do the head count on where we currently stand on the roster right now. If you just total up, the Giants were sitting there at 90. So I can do the quick rundown in the background here of all the players that have been released and then do the hard back of the napkin math here for the Giants. But the other thing is too, like, again, the Giants, because some people say, what happens if one of these players goes down, Thomas or Neal, right? And the same thing was happening when it came to a guy like Tommy DeVito. Well, should he be QB2? And just, the big step back here. Same thing with Jashuan Corbin. If Saquon Barkley goes down, it doesn't matter who comes in to replace him. If Daniel Jones goes down, it doesn't matter if it's Tyrod Taylor or if it's Tommy DeVito. Like, if guys go down, if Andrew Thomas goes down, the entire season takes on a different complexion. That's true for every team, but especially more so for the Giants at a lot of key positions.
Well, but Adam, you are right. Any season-ending injury to any of these players would make the Giants' chances of making the playoffs significantly diminish. When you talk about Andrew Thomas, Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, etc. Obviously, we understand that even guys like Dexter Lawrence on the defensive side of the ball. But the whole idea of having these backups is not to be able to say, like, well, Tyrod Taylor can come in and win as many games as Daniel Jones if he's out for the year. The idea is injuries happen, and you're saying, can we get by with this guy for 1 game, maybe 2 games? Can they fill in short spurts to make sure that the train does not get completely derailed? And so the idea is, like, if someone gets a nagging injury, which will happen at some point, can you fill in admirably in one spot, a spot start here or there, so that we don't lose a winnable game or a game where that person is the factor in whether or not we win or lose? So for me, yes, if Daniel Jones goes down, the ceiling on this team significantly changes when you go to Tommy DeVito or you go to Tyrod Taylor. But those 1 or 2 games, Adam, where you're going to be at Arizona week 2, can Matt Breida fill in for Saquon Barkley and give us a chance to win games that are winnable? That's really what I think the Giants are thinking about, because you can't have all-stars backing up all-stars at every, all pros at all these different positions. And so that's the difficult part that the Giants have to navigate here.
Well, and by the way, like, don't forget, and this is why, like, a guy like Tommy DeVito, I like what I saw. I said at the time, like, you want to tell me you develop him this year when he gets to the practice squad, and then you think about him as being QB2 going into next year. Great. Daniel Jones goes down for 1 play. Are you going to run in whatever Tyrod Taylor is not? Are you going to run in the guy that has started at the NFL level for a ton of games, or the guy that's never stepped on a regular season field at the NFL level and say, we just need 1 good one from you, Tommy? And all of a sudden he freaks out and they bring the, whatever the case may be. And comparing to Tyrod Taylor even is sometimes laughable when you look in the preseason. But remember too, in the preseason for any of these guys as well, and this goes for Eric Gray, though he was getting closer to the top reps because Matt Breida was being put kind of on ice and avoiding any concern around injury for him. Tyrod Taylor was coming in and playing with some backup offensive linemen against the starters for the Jets in preseason game number 3. Tommy DeVito comes in later and is playing against easier competition. I have a hard time with that when you watch games and you go, kid looks pretty good. David Sills looks pretty good. Right. David Sills always looks good when he's playing against other waiver wire claims and practice squad guys, right? Like that is always the relative of what you see in the preseason and how guys are going to operate. I will just say that if Saquon Barkley was going down again, I will keep coming back to, I would just give Eric Gray some run. I wish I would still have Corbin. Like the Matt Breida thing is a bother for me. There's different positions where it feels, I could go one way or the other in terms of wanting a veteran versus taking the risk on a youthful player. Running back is one of those where I just feel like you could have Matt Breida step out there and go, oh yeah, I guess he has been around a long time. There's not really a lot that he's going to give you here, huh? Okay, that feels good. Thanks so much. And then it's on Daniel Jones' legs.
Yeah, I agree with you. We both liked Jashuan Corbin last year, stuck around on the team in the practice squad. He did show flashes, albeit against second and third string type guys. Would have been great to see him stick around. We really hope that he's a guy that can make it to the practice squad. But again, I really just want to make sure that that everyone is aware that what ends up happening at 4 p.m. today is unlikely to be the roster that plays week 1 against the Dallas Cowboys. There's still going to be a handful of moves here or there for the Giants to make.
Yeah, 100%. I was seeing something in the comments, but I want to confirm it somewhere that says Cole Beasley could have been let go, maybe as the vested vet and work his way back around. We'll have to keep an eye on that. I don't see anything, at least right now, from Dan Duggan or others, but again, that wouldn't be shocking here. And I think that you're right. I think that when you look at what's happening in this moment versus what is going to be the final roster, could look very different. Let's do the last thing we'll do here before we go, actually, is just, what does your practice squad look like right now? Like, are any of these guys that you think are pretty easy to make it through? DeVito seems easy. I won't be shocked if Corbin actually makes it there, or David Sills. You got 16 spots to fill. Is there anyone that has been cut that you're hoping makes it through to the practice squad?
Yeah, we mentioned Jashuan Corbin is one of those guys that I really would like to see develop in this room. I hope that he makes it back to the practice squad. We talked about getting Tommy DeVito on there. It's always good to develop someone in-house to be able to maybe take over the backup responsibilities next season from Tyrod Taylor. Those are two guys. I mean, ideally, Tyree Phillips making the practice squad would be huge because, as many people in the comments have mentioned, that to me was one of the most surprising cuts that the Giants made. The fact that they're so thin and he got cut, you really hope that he's able to stick around and the Giants can make some other moves. Those are a handful of the guys. I don't see a guy like Oshane Ximines sticking around with the Giants at this point. If they cut him, maybe might look elsewhere for that. Same thing with guys like Jamison Crowder. Like, he may get an opportunity somewhere else. So there's just a handful of guys. I think it'll be interesting to see a guy like Sills probably end up coming back on the roster just for the familiarity for the Giants. Is there anyone that you're thinking about specifically? Maybe Fox is a name that you mentioned before that you'd like to see there, Adam?
Yeah, I think Fox is the one that jumps out to you just because it feels like one-to-one that he was more impressive at times than Oshane Ximines was last year, right? So you'd like to at least be able to flesh that out if you think that you need a little bit more time to see how you're going to go ahead and fill out your linebacking room. Outside of that, again, and I think it's the hard part about watching this team, following this team, covering this team. It's like all these cuts happen, and then when you really come down to it, you look and go, oh, yeah. Were any of those guys, guys that I just couldn't live without? The truth is no. And, even a Jashuan Corbin, who we like, well, another season from now, if he hasn't been called up and he makes it to the practice squad and you don't get anything from him, you go, okay, how many years are you a practice squad running back before you realize he's not going to factor in here, right? So then it usually comes down to draft picks and guys like Gray stepping up. It starts to push guys down in your mind. So it's fascinating, man. It looks like potentially Jordan Renan on ESPN saying that Cole Beasley is the vested vet cut and will be returning. So we won't even call that an official 53 adjustment here, as they know they have options around him. After that, man, it's just a wait and see. We will be back in probably tomorrow, at least with the update here, because the quick math tells me they probably have like another 10-ish, maybe a little bit more guys that they need to move here, which seems insane when you think about where some of the depth is on the roster and going like, well, how could you can't cut another guy here? Like, we only have so many. So we'll see where they stand on this. Any major updates, I'll probably try to hop back on here. Andy is taking time off from a beautiful weather day to make sure that he was in on this action. So we'll try to cover everything as it moves along. And then we stop. We say, okay, what do we have on the 53-man roster? What does the practice squad look like? And are we going to go beat the Dallas Cowboys? Because that's what we're going to start doing after we wrap up this week in the roster construction. Next week is going to be looking at the Dallas game. We're going to do a ton of looking at fantasy football over on FanDuel, not just from stats and different things, divisions, some surprising, I think, moves that could get made here if you want to throw a couple shekels down. So we're going to have a lot of fun, kind of a big kickoff, right, to the Giants season opener against the Dallas Cowboys. And I may have a shakeup inside the NFC East that people aren't expecting.
Well, Adam, listen, at the end of the day, as we've mentioned a few times, this is one of many phases before we find out what the exact roster is going to look like for week 1 against Dallas. I expect there to be offensive line moves. I think there might even be some linebacker moves or secondary moves. You can tell that the wide receiver room is still taking shape, Adam. So be on the lookout while we'll get close to the 53-man roster. Something tells me there'll be maybe 2 or 3 extra tweaks as we look forward to that Sunday Night Football matchup against the Cowboys.
100%, man. As always, you get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast. Thanks to everybody that came in for the live. We hope that it was going to be a fun one, get some conversations going, and we'll try to set up more of these as we head into the regular season. Over on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at Adam Armbrecht and at AndyMac214. Until next time, my friends. As Andrew Makovitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.